Settle yourself gently into this moment. Let the present loosen its grip as your breathing slows, and allow the noise of the day to drift farther away, like footsteps fading down a long stone corridor. Nothing is required of you here. You are safe to listen, to imagine, or simply to rest. Tonight, the past does not arrive as a lesson, but as a quiet landscape, a place where memory and myth move at the same pace as breath, where stories were once spoken to explain the sky, the river, and the fragile order of human life. Imagine a warm night air rising from dark soil, the scent of clay and reeds carried by a slow wind. Somewhere in the distance, firelight flickers against mud-brick walls, and voices murmur about gods whose names feel older than language itself. If sleep comes, let it come. If curiosity remains awake, let it wander. Either way, the journey begins. Long before history learned to write itself as fact, human memory shaped the world through story. In the southern plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where marshlands breathed and floodwaters reshaped the land each year, the people of Sumer imagined the universe as alive, intentional, and deeply personal. The sky was not empty. The earth was not silent. Every movement of water, every rise of kingship, every invention of craft or word was believed to echo the will of unseen powers. These powers were called the Anunnaki, not distant abstractions, but a family of divine presences thought to dwell at the foundations of reality itself. If this journey feels meaningful to you, if you find yourself returning to these ancient nights and forgotten voices, you are quietly welcome to subscribe, not as a commitment, but as a gentle promise to meet again where time slows and memory continues. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not merely gods who ruled from afar. They were imagined as architects of order, inheritors of cosmic authority passed down from an even older sky. Their names were spoken with reverence, not because they were perfect, but because they were powerful, unpredictable, and woven into every aspect of existence. Kings claimed legitimacy through them. Cities rose in their honor. Laws were believed to descend from their judgment. In this world, humanity did not stand at the center of creation. Humans were participants in a larger design, shaped to serve, to remember, and to maintain balance between earth and heaven. When floods came, they were not accidents. When prosperity arrived, it was not chance. Everything carried intention, and intention always traced back to the divine assembly that governed fate. The Anunnaki were imagined as a council rather than a single ruler. Some presided over the heavens, others over the earth and the underworld. Their hierarchy mirrored the structure of Sumerian society itself, reflecting a belief that order above demanded order below. To understand the gods was to understand how the world should function and how humans should behave within it. As clay tablets were pressed with reed styluses and stories were fixed into wedge-shaped signs, myth became memory. These were not fairy tales, but explanations for why cities existed, why suffering endured, and why rituals mattered. Through them, the Sumerians tried to make peace with forces far larger than themselves. And so, at the very beginning of civilization, before empires and before written law spread across the earth, a quiet idea took root, that humanity lived beneath ancient powers, shaped by their decisions and bound to remember them. From this belief, everything else would grow. From this belief that humanity lived beneath older powers, a particular vision of the cosmos slowly took shape. The universe, as imagined by the Sumerians, was layered rather than infinite. Heaven arched above as a solid realm, earth rested below as a fertile but fragile plain, and beneath it all lay a shadowed underworld where destinies eventually settled. Nothing existed without placement. Nothing moved without permission. The Anunnaki occupied the seams between these realms, holding together a structure that might otherwise collapse into chaos. In the earliest myths, the gods themselves were born from primordial forces. Sky and earth were once joined, pressed together in an eternal embrace. From their separation came space, time, and the possibility of motion. This act was not gentle. Creation was imagined as disruption, a necessary fracture that allowed existence to unfold. From this rupture emerged divine generations, each inheriting authority and responsibility from those before them. The Anunnaki were understood as descendants of this ancient lineage. They did not create the universe from nothing. Instead, they organized it, assigned roles, set boundaries, and enforced cycles. They were administrators of reality, ensuring that rivers flowed, seasons returned, and cities endured. Their power was immense, but it was also constrained by cosmic order older than themselves. This way of imagining the gods reflected the Sumerian experience of the world around them. Life in Mesopotamia depended on balance. Too little flood meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Survival required cooperation, foresight, and respect for forces beyond human control. The Anunnaki embodied these truths, transforming environmental uncertainty into sacred narrative. Within temples, priests recited hymns that described the gods not only as rulers, but as listeners. Offerings were given not out of blind obedience, but as participation in an ongoing exchange. Humans fed the gods through ritual, and in return hoped for protection, stability, and meaning. The relationship was unequal, yet intimate. The divine needed remembrance as much as humans needed mercy. Cities themselves were believed to belong to specific gods. Each urban center was imagined as a sacred estate, managed on behalf of its divine patron. The walls, the fields, the workshops, and the laws were all extensions of divine ownership. Kings ruled not by personal right, but as stewards appointed to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. In this context, the Anunnaki were not distant figures inhabiting an unreachable sky. They were present in every contract sealed, every oath sworn, every ritual performed at dawn or dusk. Their stories explained why justice mattered, why hierarchy existed, and why forgetting the gods invited disaster. As these myths were spoken and reshaped across generations, they became more than explanations. They became anchors of identity. To be Sumerian was to live inside this sacred order, to accept that human life was temporary but meaningful within a much larger design. And yet, even in these earliest visions, there is a quiet tension. If the gods governed all things, why did suffering persist? If order was divinely maintained, why did floods erase cities and kings fall from favor? These questions did not remain unanswered for long. They would soon give rise to stories of conflict among the gods themselves and to myths that revealed the fragile cost of cosmic order. These unanswered questions slowly gathered weight within the mythic imagination. If order existed, it was not effortless. If harmony was real, it required constant negotiation. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods as serene or distant beings of pure perfection. Instead, the Anunnaki were often portrayed as burdened by responsibility, divided by hierarchy, and strained by the very structure they maintained. At the heart of these stories lies an idea both ancient and familiar. Even the gods labored. Before humanity existed, the divine realm itself was said to depend on work. Lesser gods were tasked with maintaining the rhythms of the world, digging canals, shaping the land, sustaining the infrastructure of creation. Over time, resentment grew. The weight of endless labor pressed against divine patience, and the order of heaven began to fracture. This tension gave rise to one of the most revealing themes in Sumerian mythology. Creation was not born from generosity alone, but from necessity. Humanity emerged not as a crowning achievement, but as a solution. According to later retellings preserved in Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, humans were shaped from clay and divine essence so that the gods might be relieved of their toil. In this telling, existence itself is transactional. Life is granted purpose through service, and meaning is tied to obligation. Yet even within this framework, humans were not imagined as insignificant. The very act of being shaped by the gods placed humanity within the sacred order. To work the land, to maintain temples, to recite hymns, was to participate in cosmic balance. Labor was not punishment. It was continuity. The Anunnaki presided over this arrangement as judges and witnesses. They decreed destinies, fixed lifespans, and assigned roles. Fate, in Sumerian thought, was not random. It was written, sealed, and rarely altered. This belief lent both comfort and resignation to human life. Suffering had meaning. Prosperity carried responsibility. Nothing happened without cause. Among the divine assembly, certain figures began to stand apart. Sky gods, earth gods, gods of wisdom and storm gradually assumed clearer identities. Their relationships mirrored royal courts, complete with alliances, rivalries, and succession. Authority passed from one generation to another, not without conflict. Each transition echoed human concerns about inheritance, legitimacy, and power. Temples became the physical reflection of this cosmic structure. Rising above flat landscapes, ziggurats were imagined as meeting points between worlds. Their stepped sides symbolized ascent, not only of height, but of closeness to divine presence. At their summits, priests enacted rituals believed to sustain the bond between mortals and gods. Smoke rose, offerings were laid, words were spoken with care, for language itself was considered sacred. Writing, too, belonged to this divine economy. The invention of cuneiform was not seen as a human achievement alone. It was believed to be a gift of the gods, a tool for preserving order against the erosion of time. To inscribe a tablet was to resist forgetting, to anchor the fragile present within eternal memory. And yet, beneath this intricate system, the same quiet unease remained. If the gods were wise, why did they argue? If fate was fixed, why did myths change? The answers lay not in perfection, but in cycle. The Anunnaki governed a universe that moved not toward resolution, but toward repetition. Creation, conflict, destruction, and renewal were not failures of the system. They were the system itself. As these stories continued to unfold, they would soon center on a singular moment of upheaval, a mythic confrontation that reshaped divine hierarchy, redefined kingship, and left an imprint that would echo far beyond Sumer. The rise of one god over others would become a story of order reclaimed through violence, and of balance restored at great cost. That moment of upheaval emerges from the deep silence between generations of gods. As myths were refined and retold, particularly in later Mesopotamian traditions, the story of cosmic conflict became clearer, more deliberate, and more symbolic. At its center was the idea that order could not endure without renewal, and renewal could not come without struggle. The divine world, like the human one, was subject to crisis. In these stories, the universe itself became restless. The younger gods, energetic and numerous, disturbed the ancient stillness of the primordial powers. Their movement, their noise, their vitality threatened the old equilibrium. What had once been calm became strained, and tension rose between generations who no longer understood one another. The cosmos was no longer a settled inheritance. It was a contested space. From this unrest arose the mythic drama that would define divine kingship. A champion emerged among the younger gods, one who embodied strength, authority, and the capacity to confront chaos directly. His rise was not inevitable. It was negotiated, promised, and conditional. Power, even among gods, required consent. The conflict itself was imagined not merely as a battle, but as a reordering of reality. Chaos took form as a vast, formless presence associated with the primeval waters from which all things once emerged. To confront it was to confront the possibility of dissolution, of a return to a state before meaning and distinction. Victory meant more than survival. It meant the preservation of structure. When order was restored, it was sealed through creation. The defeated forces were not erased, but transformed. From their remains, the cosmos was reshaped. Sky was lifted into place. Earth was secured below. Boundaries were set so that waters would no longer overwhelm the land without warning. This act of creative violence became a sacred explanation for why the world was both beautiful and broken. In the aftermath, kingship among the gods was redefined. Authority was centralized. The divine assembly acknowledged a new hierarchy, one justified not by age alone, but by action. This shift reflected changing human societies as well. As cities grew larger and power consolidated, myth adapted. The heavens mirrored the political realities below. For the people who listened to these stories by lamplight and hearth, the message was clear. Stability required guardianship. Law required force. Peace was not the absence of conflict, but the careful containment of it. The gods had faced chaos and prevailed, but the cost was remembered. Humanity's place within this renewed order became more clearly defined. Humans were to uphold the balance that gods had secured. Through ritual, obedience, and remembrance, mortals participated in maintaining a world that could always slip backward if neglected. Forgetting was dangerous. Silence was risky. The gods demanded acknowledgement not out of vanity but necessity. These myths did not offer comfort in the modern sense. They offered explanation. They told people why storms came, why kings ruled, why suffering and structure existed side by side. In doing so, they allowed life to continue within uncertainty. And yet, even as order was proclaimed restored, the stories themselves hinted at fragility. Chaos was never destroyed, only restrained. The memory of near collapse lingered beneath every ritual and law. The world endured, but only so long as its stories were told, its gods remembered, and its balance respected. This lingering awareness would shape how floods were remembered, how laws were inscribed, and how humanity understood its own impermanence. The next chapter of this mythic vision would turn toward the earth once more, toward cities and temples, and toward the fragile bond that tied divine order to human hands. From this fragile restoration of order, attention slowly returned to the world below. The gods had secured the cosmos, but its maintenance now depended on human presence. Cities became the living interface between heaven and earth, places where divine intention was anchored in brick, water, and ritual movement. To the Sumerians, a city was not merely a settlement, it was a sacred organism, breathing through its people, sustained by the favor of its god. Each city rose around a central temple complex, and each temple was believed to be a dwelling place, not a symbol. The god did not simply watch from afar. The god resided there. The streets, the canals, the granaries, and the surrounding fields were understood as extensions of divine property. Humans lived and worked within an estate owned by powers older than memory. This belief shaped daily life in subtle ways. Labor was offered with reverence. Offerings were prepared with care. Festivals followed sacred calendars that aligned human time with cosmic rhythm. To neglect ritual was to invite imbalance, not only spiritually, but materially. Crops might fail. Floods might come unrestrained. The gods responded to attention, and absence was felt as risk. Kingship, too, took on a new gravity within this worldview. A king was not a god, but neither was he merely human. He stood at the threshold between realms, responsible for translating divine will into earthly order. His authority rested not in personal strength alone, but in his perceived closeness to the gods. When he ruled justly, it was said the gods smiled upon the city. When he failed, disaster was interpreted as divine withdrawal. Law emerged as a sacred instrument within this system. To write laws was to imitate the gods, fixing order against chaos through words impressed into clay. Justice was not flexible or subjective. It was inherited. To violate law was to disturb the balance the gods had established at the beginning of time. In this way, morality itself was cosmic, not individual. Priests served as intermediaries, trained to read signs and interpret silence. Dreams, omens, and celestial movements were carefully observed, not as superstition, but as communication. The gods spoke through patterns. Humans listened through tradition. Knowledge accumulated slowly, preserved through repetition and memory rather than innovation. Writing became essential to this process. Cuneiform tablets recorded offerings, contracts, hymns, and myths, all serving the same purpose. They prevented forgetting. Forgetting was the true enemy. It allowed chaos to seep back into the world, eroding boundaries set by divine effort long ago. Yet even as cities flourished, an underlying awareness persisted. Human achievements were temporary. Walls crumbled, canals silted, dynasties ended, the gods endured, but their favor moved. No city was eternal, no king ruled forever. This impermanence was not tragic, it was expected. In this understanding, civilization itself was a cycle, rising and falling like the waters that sustained it. The Anunnaki presided over these rhythms, not with sentiment, but with continuity. They remembered what humans forgot. They carried the weight of ages, watching as one city replaced another, as names changed but patterns remained. And so, beneath the steady rituals and ordered streets, there lingered a quiet humility. Humanity was not master of its fate, but participant in a design far older than any city. This awareness did not diminish life's meaning. It gave it shape. Soon, this fragile balance would be tested again, not by internal decay alone, but by forces that overwhelmed memory itself. The myths would turn toward water, toward judgment, and toward a moment when the gods reconsidered the place of humanity within the world they had shaped. That turn toward water begins not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual withdrawal of patience. In the myths that followed the establishment of cities and laws, the gods are described as watching humanity closely, not with constant anger, but with careful attention. The world they had ordered was alive, active, and increasingly noisy. Human population grew, cities multiplied, rituals continued, but devotion was uneven. The careful balance once maintained through remembrance began to strain. In these stories, the gods did not respond to human excess with immediate punishment. Instead, they deliberated. Councils were convened. Voices differed. Some gods favored mercy, understanding humanity's limitations and fragility. Others saw disorder returning, threatening the structure secured through ancient sacrifice. The Anunnaki were not unanimous. Their divinity did not erase disagreement. It magnified it. Noise becomes a powerful symbol in these myths, not merely sound, but disruption. Humanity's presence disturbed the stillness of the cosmos, much as younger gods once unsettled their elders. The parallel is deliberate. Just as divine generations had once clashed, now humanity risked repeating the same imbalance on a smaller scale. Creation, it seemed, carried the seed of its own unrest. The decision that followed was not framed as cruelty, but correction. Floodwaters were imagined as a reset, a return to primordial conditions, where form dissolved back into formlessness. Water had created life, and water could unmake it. In this way, destruction was not an end, but a clearing, a preparation for renewal. Yet even within this judgment, compassion surfaced. A single human was warned. Instructions were given quietly, indirectly, through dreams and whispers. A vessel was built, not as an escape from fate, but as a preservation of continuity. Life, memory, and order would not be erased entirely. They would be carried forward, sealed within wood and pitch, waiting for calm. The flood itself was not brief. It was imagined as overwhelming, relentless, and total. Cities vanished beneath water. Temples dissolved. Boundaries disappeared. For a moment, the world returned to the state that existed before God's imposed structure. Silence followed, heavy and complete. When the waters receded, the earth emerged altered, fragile, empty. The gods themselves were said to feel the weight of what had been done. Offerings ceased. Hymns fell silent. In some versions, the gods experienced hunger and regret, realizing that humanity's role in sustaining the divine order had been underestimated. The relationship between gods and humans shifted subtly but permanently. From this point forward, limits were introduced, lifespans shortened, population controls were imagined. Suffering was redistributed into disease and mortality rather than total annihilation. The flood became a boundary marker in memory, a reminder of how close the world had come to erasure. For those who told these stories centuries later, the flood was not only about water, it was about restraint, about the necessity of balance between creation and correction. It explained why the world was imperfect, why death existed, and why remembrance mattered more than ever. As civilizations rose again along familiar rivers, the flood lived on as warning and wisdom. It echoed through rituals, laws, and stories passed from generation to generation. And as these myths traveled beyond Sumer into new languages and cultures, the image of divine judgment through water would take on new forms, reshaped by time, but rooted in the same ancient fear and hope. The next movement of this journey follows that outward spread. How Sumerian myth crossed borders, adapted to new empires, and quietly shaped the imagination of the ancient world far beyond its birthplace. As these stories moved outward from their place of origin, they did not remain unchanged. They traveled with merchants, scribes, priests, and conquerors, carried along the same river routes that moved grain and copper and stone. Each culture that encountered the myths of Sumer received them not as fixed scripture, but as living material, capable of adaptation. The names shifted, the emphasis changed, yet the underlying structure remained recognizable, like a melody played on different instruments. In Akkadian and Babylonian traditions, the Anunnaki became more sharply defined, their roles clarified within a more centralized divine hierarchy. The myths grew more formal, more literary, shaped by royal courts and imperial ambition. Stories that once explained survival in a fragile landscape now also justified empire, authority, and expansion. Divine order mirrored political order, and cosmic kingship reflected human rule on a grander scale. The flood narrative, in particular, proved enduring. It resurfaced again and again, reshaped to fit new moral frameworks and theological concerns. What had once been a story about balance and restraint became, in some retellings, a lesson about obedience, righteousness, or divine favor. Yet beneath these interpretations, the original tension remained. Humanity lived at the mercy of forces it could neither control nor fully understand. Writing preserved these transformations. Clay tablets copied and recopied across centuries fixed certain versions of the myths while allowing others to fade. Scribes did not merely record stories. They curated memory. What was written endured. What was not slowly dissolved into silence. In this way, mythology itself became subject to the same cycles it described. As time passed, the Anunnaki grew more distant in the imagination. New gods rose to prominence. New symbols replaced old ones. Yet traces of the earlier worldview persisted, embedded in law codes, ritual language, and assumptions about fate and justice. Even when the names were forgotten, the structure of the cosmos they described continued to shape thought. For the people living within these later civilizations, the ancient myths offered continuity. They suggested that the present was not isolated, but connected to a long chain of decisions, disasters, and renewals. The world had ended before. It had begun again, and it would likely do so once more. This awareness fostered both humility and resilience. Human life was brief, but it mattered. Actions echoed beyond a single lifetime, carried forward through memory and consequence. To live well was not to escape fate, but to align with it as best one could. As these ideas spread farther still, crossing into lands with their own traditions and gods, they mingled, merged, and transformed once more. The Anunnaki faded into the background, but their influence lingered, quiet and persistent, shaping how future cultures imagined creation, judgment, and the delicate bond between the divine and the human. And in this slow diffusion of myth, something subtle occurred. The gods became less immediate, more abstract. The world grew larger, the cosmos more distant. Yet the ancient questions remained, waiting beneath the surface, ready to re-emerge whenever humanity looked back toward its beginnings and wondered why the stories felt so familiar. Those familiar feelings arise because the myths never truly vanished. They settled into the deep layers of cultural memory, where stories stop being remembered as stories and begin to feel like intuition. Long after the names of the Anunnaki faded from everyday speech, their patterns remained. The idea of a divine council, of laws descending from above, of humanity created with purpose yet constrained by limits, continued to echo across centuries. In the later world, gods became fewer, then singular, but authority still flowed downward. Order was still imagined as something granted rather than invented. Even when belief systems changed, the structure of meaning endured. Heaven remained a source of law. Earth remained a place of testing. Humanity remained suspended between obedience and aspiration. This is how ancient myth survives, not through accuracy, but through resonance. The Sumerians did not pass down facts as we define them now. They passed down frameworks, ways of understanding why the world is unstable, why power concentrates, why destruction follows growth, and why memory itself feels sacred. Within this framework, the Anunnaki are less important as individual figures and more significant as an idea. They represent the belief that reality is governed, that chaos is restrained by intention, and that humanity participates in a story larger than itself. Whether these gods were imagined as compassionate or severe mattered less than the certainty that they existed, watching, weighing, deciding. This certainty offered comfort in a harsh environment. Floodplains could destroy years of labor overnight. Drought could empty granaries. War could erase cities. To believe that these events followed a pattern, even a painful one, was to resist despair. Meaning was survival. As writing evolved and cultures layered new interpretations onto old foundations, the myths became quieter. They receded into epics, rituals, and fragments quoted without context. Yet even fragments carry power. They suggest that the present moment is not isolated, that humanity has always struggled with the same questions of responsibility, limitation, and continuity. In this sense, the Anunnaki never truly disappeared. They transformed into symbols, into archetypes, into the unspoken assumption that order is fragile and must be maintained, that forgetting invites collapse, and that memory is a form of devotion. As this journey moves deeper, the focus will shift again, from the outward spread of myth to the inward meanings that modern minds have drawn from it. How ancient symbols were reinterpreted, reimagined, and sometimes misunderstood. How myth became theory, and theory became belief. The old stories are patient. They wait for each generation to approach them with new questions. And when we do, they reveal not answers, but reflections. What we see in them often says as much about us as it does about the people who first shaped them beside ancient rivers, under wide and watchful skies. Those reflections become especially vivid when modern eyes return to ancient myth, seeking explanation rather than meaning. In recent centuries, the Anunnaki have been pulled from their original cultural landscape and placed into new frameworks shaped by science, speculation, and modern unease. What were once symbolic figures of order and responsibility have at times been reimagined as literal beings, visitors, engineers, or forgotten rulers of humanity's past. This shift says less about ancient Sumer and more about the modern world that interprets it. As traditional sources of meaning weakened, old myths were revisited with new expectations. The language of gods was reread through the lens of technology. Divine descent became a rival. Sacred knowledge became advanced instruction. The heavens were no longer spiritual realms, but physical destinations. In these reinterpretations, the Anunnaki were transformed into something closer to ourselves. They were given bodies, tools, intentions that mirrored human ambition and fear. Where ancient myth spoke of cosmic order, modern theory often seeks hidden control. Where Sumerian stories explained responsibility within limits, contemporary retellings sometimes search for lost superiority or forgotten mastery. This transformation did not occur in isolation. It emerged alongside rapid technological change, space exploration, and a growing sense that humanity stood on the edge of something vast and unknown. Ancient myths offered familiar shapes for unfamiliar questions. If the universe was larger than imagined, perhaps the gods had always come from beyond. If human origins felt uncertain, perhaps they had been guided. Yet something is lost when myth is flattened into literal history. The subtlety fades. The layered meanings dissolve. The Anunnaki were never meant to answer how the universe works in a mechanical sense. They existed to answer why life feels ordered yet fragile, why power demands responsibility, and why forgetting carries consequences. When we read ancient texts without their cultural context, we risk mistaking poetry for record and symbol for blueprint. Ziggurats become launch platforms, hymns become reports, creation stories become technical manuals. In doing so, we replace one mystery with another, often louder but no deeper. Still, the persistence of these reinterpretations reveals something enduring. Humanity continues to sense that its story did not begin in isolation. Whether framed as gods, ancestors, or visitors, the longing is the same: to belong to a larger narrative, to feel guided rather than accidental, to believe that meaning precedes us. In this way, modern myths about the Anunnaki are not distortions alone. They are continuations, new stories layered onto old ones, shaped by contemporary hopes and anxieties. They reflect a world that has gained knowledge but lost certainty, that can measure stars yet struggles to explain purpose. As we move further into this journey, it becomes important to return gently to the ancient mindset itself, to step back from modern assumptions and listen again to the myths as they were meant to be heard, not as revelations of hidden technology, but as quiet meditations on order, duty, and remembrance. Only then can we begin to understand what the Anunnaki truly represented to the people who first spoke their names. Not visitors from elsewhere, but mirrors held up to the human condition, reflecting our dependence on balance, our fear of chaos, and our enduring need to believe that the world, however fragile, is held together by something greater than chance. To listen as the ancients listened requires a deliberate slowing down. It means setting aside the impulse to extract conclusions and instead allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. For the Sumerians, myth was not something to be solved. It was something to inhabit, a shared space of understanding where the world's uncertainty could be held without needing to be conquered. In this space, the Anunnaki were not mysteries demanding explanation, but presences that gave shape to experience. They were invoked when contracts were sworn, when kings were crowned, when illness struck, and when harvests failed. Their relevance lay not in spectacle, but in consistency. They were always there, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The stories were often cyclical, returning to the same themes with slight variations. Creation followed destruction, authority was challenged, then reaffirmed. Balance was lost, then restored. These repetitions were not flaws in storytelling. They reflected a worldview in which time itself was not linear but layered. The past was not gone. It lingered, active and influential. This sense of layered time shaped how memory was valued. To remember was to participate in continuity. To forget was to invite collapse. Tablets were copied not because they were new, but because they were old. Their age granted authority. Their repetition ensured survival. In a world where flood and fire could erase everything, memory was the most durable structure available. The Anunnaki presided over this fragile continuity. They were imagined as ancient beyond reckoning, yet attentive to the present. They remembered what humanity could not. They carried the weight of previous cycles, previous worlds, previous failures. In doing so, they embodied the idea that existence itself has a memory, that nothing truly begins from nothing. Even the underworld reflected this logic. It was not a place of moral judgment, but of return. All beings eventually moved downward, regardless of status. Kings and laborers shared the same dust. This vision stripped life of illusion while preserving dignity. Meaning was found not in reward after death, but in alignment during life. Within such a framework, the question was never whether the gods existed, but whether humans were listening. Misfortune was not proof of abandonment. It was often interpreted as misalignment, a sign that rituals had been neglected or boundaries crossed. Correction was possible, but it required attention, humility, and patience. As centuries passed and new empires absorbed the land of Sumer, this attentiveness slowly weakened. The old rituals were maintained, but their inner stillness faded. Myth became performance rather than participation. The Anunnaki were still named, but less deeply felt. Yet even diminished, the myths endured. They waited within libraries, within fragments, within the assumptions carried forward into later belief systems. Their quiet persistence suggests that something essential was preserved, even as forms changed. This is the paradox at the heart of ancient mythology. It is both fragile and resilient, easily misunderstood, easily repurposed, yet difficult to erase. The Anunnaki remain not because they were powerful gods, but because they articulated a truth that still resonates. That order must be maintained, that memory is sacred, and that humanity lives within a story far older than itself. As this exploration continues, the focus will move deeper into the symbolic language of these myths, toward the images, numbers, and patterns that carried meaning beyond words, toward the hidden architecture of myth itself, where cosmology, ritual, and psychology quietly converge. This hidden architecture begins with symbols that feel simple on the surface, but carry deep weight when repeated over centuries. Numbers, directions, and materials were never neutral in Sumerian myth. They were chosen carefully, embedded with meaning that listeners absorbed intuitively rather than analytically. The Anunnaki existed within this symbolic language, not as isolated characters, but as expressions of cosmic structure. The number 7, for example, appears again and again. 7 divine judges, 7 decrees of fate, 7 gates of the underworld. This repetition was not decorative. It reflected an attempt to mirror celestial order on Earth, to align human understanding with perceived cosmic patterns. The sky, observed carefully through generations, became a template for meaning. Stars moved in cycles. Planets wandered with intention. Time revealed itself through repetition rather than progress. Space, too, was sacred. The world was divided into regions that corresponded to divine authority. Sky, earth, and underworld formed a vertical axis, while the 4 cardinal directions stretched outward, stabilizing the land. Temples were aligned deliberately. Rituals followed orientation. To stand in the wrong place, to face the wrong direction, was to disrupt harmony. Materials carried memory. Clay was not chosen for tablets by accident. It came from the earth itself, shaped by water, hardened by fire. To write on clay was to enact creation in miniature. The same elements that formed humanity were used to preserve its words. In this way, writing became both practical and symbolic, binding human effort to cosmic process. The Anunnaki were imagined as masters of these elements. They controlled water, wind, fertility, and decay. Their favor meant balance among forces that could otherwise overwhelm. Their anger was not personal, but elemental. Storms did not punish individuals. They corrected systems. This understanding shaped how fear was experienced. The Sumerians did not fear chaos as something external. They feared imbalance, the gradual slipping of order through neglect, arrogance, or forgetfulness. Catastrophe was rarely sudden in myth. It was prepared slowly through small failures of attention. Ritual existed to counter this drift. Daily offerings, seasonal festivals, and elaborate ceremonies all served the same purpose. They reminded both gods and humans of their roles. Ritual was memory enacted through movement. It kept the world aligned by repeating what had worked before. In this sense, myth, ritual, and cosmology were inseparable. The Anunnaki were present not only in stories, but in gestures, timings, and silences. To live correctly was to move in rhythm with them, even without conscious awareness. As later cultures inherited these symbols, some meanings shifted while others endured. Numbers lost their sacred weight. Directions became practical rather than symbolic. Materials were valued for efficiency rather than memory. Yet traces remained, embedded in architecture, calendars, and religious practice. The slow erosion of symbolic understanding did not happen all at once. It unfolded across centuries, almost imperceptibly. And yet, something essential was altered. When symbols lose their depth, stories begin to feel hollow. They survive, but without their original gravity. This is where modern distance from ancient myth becomes most apparent. We can read the words, but we often miss the rhythm beneath them. We see characters where there were once forces. We look for narrative where there was once alignment. And still, if listened to patiently, the old myths speak. They do not demand belief. They invite recognition, a remembering of a time when the world was felt as alive, ordered, and precariously balanced. As this journey continues, we move closer to the point where symbol and story meet catastrophe once more, where balance is tested not only by noise or neglect, but by ambition. The myths will turn again toward power, toward kingship, and toward the enduring question of how authority is justified in a world shaped by gods. That question of authority sits quietly beneath every Sumerian myth, shaping not only how gods were imagined, but how humans organized themselves beneath them. Power was never assumed to be self-generated. It was always granted, inherited, or withdrawn. Kingship, in particular, was understood as something that descended rather than arose. A king did not seize authority. He received it, temporarily, conditionally, and at great risk. In the earliest traditions, kingship was said to have come down from heaven itself. This was not metaphorical in the ancient mind. It meant that order, law, and legitimacy originated beyond human desire. A king ruled not because he was strongest, but because the gods had turned their attention toward him. His success proved divine favor. His failure signaled its loss. This belief created a fragile tension at the heart of power. A ruler was elevated, but never secure. Every drought, every military defeat, every unusual omen carried political weight. The gods were believed to speak through circumstance. To rule was to live under constant interpretation, watched by priests, citizens, and the divine assembly alike. The Anunnaki stood behind this system as witnesses and enforcers. They were imagined as the ones who fixed destinies, measured reigns, and determined when a city's time had ended. Dynasties rose and fell, not because of chance, but because their allotted span had been fulfilled. History itself became a sacred rhythm rather than a sequence of accidents. This understanding shaped how ambition was viewed. To desire power excessively was dangerous. It risked overstepping the role assigned by the gods. Myths warned repeatedly against hubris, not in abstract terms, but through the quiet certainty that imbalance invites correction. When a king forgot his place, the world responded. Even heroic figures were bound by this logic. Their strength was admired, but always limited. They could confront chaos, build walls, and secure peace, yet they could not escape mortality or divine judgment. Their greatness lay not in defying the gods, but in recognizing their boundaries. Law codes emerged from this worldview as extensions of divine will. Justice was not negotiable. It was discovered, revealed, and recorded. To change law without divine sanction was to tamper with the fabric of order. In this sense, morality was external rather than internal. Right and wrong were not matters of conscience alone, but of alignment with cosmic decree. Over time, as empires expanded and power centralized, this sacred restraint began to thin. Kings spoke more boldly of their own strength. Divine favor was still claimed, but less questioned. The gods remained present, yet more distant. Authority shifted subtly from participation in order to control over it. This shift did not erase the old myths. It strained them. Stories that once cautioned humility were reinterpreted as endorsements of conquest. The Anunnaki became supporters of empire rather than guardians of balance. Myth adjusted to power, even as it quietly preserved its older warnings. These tensions left traces in the stories themselves. Contradictions emerged. Gods disagreed more sharply. Punishments seemed harsher. Mercy appeared uneven. What had once felt like shared responsibility between heaven and earth began to feel like domination from above. Yet beneath these changes, the core idea endured. Power without balance leads to collapse. Authority without remembrance invites chaos. Whether applied to gods or kings, the lesson remained intact, waiting to be recognized. As the myths continue to unfold, they will return once more to this fragile edge, to moments when power forgets its origin, when order is mistaken for permanence, and when the world responds not with argument, but with reset. That return to reset appears quietly at first, woven into the background of stories rather than announced as catastrophe. The myths suggest that collapse rarely arrives without warning. It gathers through neglect, through the gradual erosion of ritual, memory, and restraint. What was once sacred becomes habitual. What was once meaningful becomes mechanical. Order continues outwardly, even as its inner coherence weakens. In this state, the gods are described as growing distant, not because they abandon the world, but because the world stops listening. Signs are still given, but they are misread or ignored. Omens lose their urgency. Dreams are dismissed. The careful dialogue between heaven and earth thins until it becomes almost silent. The Anunnaki, in these moments, are not portrayed as vengeful. They are portrayed as patient. They wait. Their judgment is not reactive, but cumulative. When correction finally comes, it feels sudden only because the slow buildup has gone unnoticed. This pattern mirrors natural cycles familiar to the Sumerians. Rivers do not destroy fields without first rising gradually. Salinity does not ruin soil overnight. Collapse follows accumulation. Myth uses divine language to express this environmental truth, translating observation into narrative. When reset arrives, it is rarely total. Even the flood spared memory. Survivors carried stories forward, re-establishing ritual and law. The gods did not seek silence forever. They sought recalibration. The world was meant to continue, but differently. This perspective changes how destruction is understood. It is not meaningless loss. It is transformation under pressure. In myth, what survives is what remembers. What forgets, dissolves. As centuries passed, later cultures inherited these stories, but often lost this nuance. Destruction became moral punishment rather than structural correction. Divine anger replaced imbalance. The subtlety of the Sumerian worldview was compressed into simpler frameworks. Yet the original logic can still be felt beneath the surface. It appears whenever myths emphasize cycles over endings, renewal over finality. The Anunnaki were not judges of souls. They were keepers of continuity. Their concern was not individual virtue, but collective alignment. This distinction matters. It suggests a worldview where responsibility is shared, where suffering is not always personal, and where survival depends on awareness rather than innocence. The world responds to patterns, not intentions. In such a system, hope does not come from exemption, but from attention. To notice imbalance early, to remember before correction is required, to maintain rhythm rather than demand rescue. As this journey continues, we move closer to the final arc of the ancient imagination, toward the long afterlife of these myths, how they lingered through conquest and collapse, how they resurfaced in unexpected forms, and how, even now, they whisper a warning that feels strangely familiar. The Anunnaki no longer rule temples or cities, but the patterns they embodied remain active, waiting to be recognized wherever order is assumed to be permanent and memory is taken for granted. Those lingering patterns become most visible when civilizations believe themselves immune to collapse. The myths seem to reawaken precisely at moments of greatest confidence, when order feels secure and continuity is assumed. In these times, ancient stories act less like distant relics and more like quiet reminders, resurfacing to question certainty rather than reinforce it. For the Sumerians, permanence was never expected. Cities were built with the knowledge that they would one day fall. Temples were restored repeatedly, not preserved unchanged. Even the gods moved on. Favor shifted. Sacred centers lost prominence, and others rose in their place. Change was not failure. It was rhythm. This acceptance shaped how history itself was understood. Time was not a straight path forward. It was layered, recursive, and cyclical. Events echoed earlier events. Kings mirrored previous kings. Disasters repeated familiar shapes. To recognize these patterns was to possess wisdom. To ignore them was to repeat mistakes already inscribed in myth. The Anunnaki embodied this temporal depth. They were imagined as ancient beyond measure, having witnessed multiple worlds, multiple resets. Their authority came not from raw power alone, but from memory. They remembered what humans could not. They carried the imprint of previous cycles, holding knowledge that stretched beyond a single age. This concept of inherited memory is central to understanding why the myths endured. They offered continuity where history fragmented. When one empire replaced another, the stories bridged the gap. They whispered that what was happening had happened before, that collapse was survivable, and that renewal was possible if memory was preserved. As writing spread and cultures layered new meanings onto old texts, this sense of cyclical time was gradually reshaped. Linear histories emerged. Progress became a dominant narrative. The past was framed as something left behind rather than something active. In this shift, myth lost some of its immediacy. Yet even within linear thinking, the old cycles continued to assert themselves. Empires rose and fell. Resources were exhausted. Inequality widened. Environmental limits were reached. Each time the pattern felt new, yet strangely familiar. The myths seemed to echo from beneath the surface, reminding humanity that structure without balance cannot last. This is why ancient stories retain their power even when belief fades. They are not predictions. They are reflections. They describe how systems behave when stretched beyond alignment. They encode observations gathered over generations, preserved through narrative rather than data. In the figure of the Anunnaki, these observations take on form. They remind us that authority must answer to something older than itself, that creation carries responsibility, that silence, neglect, and excess all have consequences. As the journey moves forward, we will approach the quiet closing phase of the mythic cycle. Not an ending, but a release, a gradual fading of divine immediacy, and a transfer of responsibility. The gods do not vanish abruptly. They recede, leaving behind patterns, stories, and a fragile inheritance. What remains is humanity, standing within a world shaped by forgotten agreements, ancient rhythms, and memories half remembered. The question that follows is not whether the gods still watch, but whether we still recognize the patterns they once embodied. That inheritance settles quietly into human hands as the gods begin to recede from daily life. In the later imagination, divine presence does not disappear entirely, but it becomes more distant, less immediate. The world continues to function, rituals persist, laws endure, yet something subtle has shifted. Responsibility no longer feels shared in the same way. Humanity stands more exposed, more alone within the vastness it once explained through gods. This transition is not described as rebellion or abandonment. It unfolds gradually, almost unnoticed. The Anunnaki withdraw not because they are defeated, but because their role has been fulfilled. Order has been established. Memory has been seeded. The patterns are in place. What remains is the long test of whether humanity can sustain balance without constant divine intervention. In mythic terms, this is a dangerous moment. When guidance becomes implicit rather than explicit, interpretation replaces instruction. Humans must read the world itself for meaning rather than rely solely on divine decree. Rivers, stars, seasons, and consequences become teachers. The universe speaks more softly now. This quiet withdrawal may explain why later traditions struggle with uncertainty. Without visible gods to blame or appease, suffering becomes harder to contextualize. Responsibility feels heavier. Failure feels personal rather than cosmic. The old stories remain, but their authority weakens as belief fragments. Yet the Anunnaki are not gone. They survive as structure rather than presence, as assumptions about how the world works, as the belief that actions ripple outward, that imbalance accumulates, and that forgetting carries cost. These ideas persist even when the gods' names are no longer spoken. In this sense, myth does not end. It internalizes. What was once external authority becomes inner awareness. Law moves from tablet to conscience. Ritual becomes habit. Memory becomes history. The sacred disperses into the ordinary. This dispersal carries both freedom and risk. Without gods to enforce balance, humanity gains agency. But agency without memory can become reckless. The old myths warned of this moment. They did not promise safety. They offered guidance, if it could be remembered. As civilizations continued to rise atop older ruins, this buried inheritance shaped decisions invisibly. Cities were still built near rivers. Laws still sought permanence. Leaders still claimed legitimacy through connection to something greater than themselves. Even in denial, the pattern persisted. The Anunnaki, as figures, fade into shadow. But as ideas, they remain active. They remind us that creation is not a single event, but an ongoing responsibility. That order must be renewed, not assumed. That silence from the divine does not mean absence, but expectation. As we move deeper into the final movement of this journey, the focus turns inward, toward reflection rather than explanation, toward what these ancient myths leave behind when belief loosens and certainty dissolves, toward the quiet question that remains when the gods step back and the world continues on its own fragile terms. That quiet question lingers in the spaces where certainty once lived. When the gods step back, the world does not end. it continues. Seasons turn, rivers flood and recede. Children are born beneath the same sky that once carried divine intention. What changes is not the structure of reality, but the way meaning is carried within it. For the Sumerians, this transition was never fully articulated as loss. It was sensed, a gradual thinning of presence, like a voice growing softer with distance. Rituals remained precise, hymns unchanged, yet something ineffable had shifted. The gods were still addressed, but answers felt slower, less distinct. Silence became part of the dialogue. This silence did not imply indifference. It implied expectation. The myths suggest that once order is established, its maintenance becomes a shared responsibility. Humanity was no longer simply guided, it was entrusted. The Anunnaki had shaped the framework, but living within it required attentiveness, restraint, and remembrance. In this sense, myth begins to resemble instruction rather than explanation, not commandments, but patterns, warnings encoded in story, reminders that imbalance accumulates quietly, that excess rarely announces itself, and that collapse often feels surprising only because its signs were ignored. The world described by these myths is not moral in the modern sense. It does not reward intention or punish ignorance evenly. It responds to alignment. Fields thrive when water is managed carefully. Cities endure when labor is shared. Societies remain stable when memory is preserved. These truths are expressed through gods, because gods were the most powerful language available. As belief systems evolved, this language changed. Gods became fewer, then singular, then abstract. Yet the underlying patterns did not dissolve. They resurfaced as philosophy, law, and eventually science. Cause and effect replaced divine will, but the structure remained familiar. This continuity explains why ancient myths still feel relevant even when belief fades. They do not depend on faith to function. They depend on recognition. When we encounter them, we sense something known but unspoken, a reminder that the world operates within limits, and that ignoring those limits carries cost. The Anunnaki, then, are not relics of superstition. They are early expressions of systemic awareness. They personified forces that humans could observe, but not yet describe analytically. Floods, fertility, authority, and collapse were given faces so they could be remembered and respected. As this awareness deepens, the myths become less about gods and more about inheritance. What was learned through generations of survival was encoded into story, passed forward not as data, but as atmosphere, a way of feeling the world rather than measuring it. This is why the journey does not end with disbelief. It ends with attentiveness. The question is no longer whether the gods are real, but whether we still listen to the patterns they once embodied, whether we recognize imbalance before it demands correction, whether memory still holds weight in a world that moves faster than remembrance. As the final arc approaches, the narrative turns fully inward, toward reflection, release, and the quiet acceptance that ancient stories were never meant to give answers that end inquiry. They were meant to keep inquiry alive, gently, patiently, across the long span of human time. That patience is perhaps the most enduring quality of ancient myth. It does not rush toward resolution. It waits. It allows generations to come and go, knowing that understanding ripens slowly, often long after belief has shifted. The stories of the Anunnaki were shaped with this patience, designed not to convince, but to endure. As time moved forward, the world grew louder. Cities expanded beyond what their founders imagined. Writing multiplied. Knowledge accumulated. Yet the quiet awareness carried by myth did not vanish. It became harder to hear, buried beneath layers of interpretation and reinterpretation, but it remained present, like a low current beneath a river's surface. In this quieter role, myth began to function less as explanation and more as echo. It resurfaced during moments of uncertainty, when established systems faltered and confidence wavered. People returned to old stories not because they believed them literally, but because they recognized something familiar within them, a pattern, a warning, a reassurance that instability was not new. The Anunnaki, once imagined as active governors of reality, now exist primarily as memory. But memory itself has power. It shapes expectations. It influences decisions. It reminds societies that order is not permanent, that creation requires care, and that excess invites correction. This memory does not speak loudly. It does not demand ritual or sacrifice. It lingers in assumptions about responsibility, in discomfort with unchecked power, in the recurring sense that systems must answer to something beyond immediate desire. These intuitions are the afterlife of myth. In the ancient world, these ideas were anchored in gods because gods were shared language. Today they surface through different forms: environmental concern, ethical debate, historical reflection. Each is a modern expression of an ancient awareness that balance matters. What changes is not the pattern, but the metaphor. The Anunnaki were metaphors that could walk, speak, and judge. They carried complexity in human form so it could be remembered. As those forms fade, the complexity remains, searching for new shapes. This transformation does not diminish the myths. It fulfills them. Stories meant to endure must evolve. They must be able to survive disbelief, reinterpretation, and even dismissal. The Anunnaki have done this quietly, slipping from meaning to structure, from belief to intuition. As we approach the closing movement of this journey, the emphasis shifts once more, away from history, away from reinterpretation, and toward the listener, toward the question of what it means to carry these stories now, in a world both vastly different and strangely familiar. The ancient myths do not ask us to return to them. They ask us to notice where we already stand within their patterns, to recognize that every civilization, every system, every life exists within cycles of creation, maintenance, and release. In this recognition, the Anunnaki speak again, not as gods demanding worship, but as reminders of continuity, of the long memory of the world, of the quiet truth that nothing truly stands alone, and nothing truly begins without inheritance. Standing within that inheritance can feel unsettling. It strips away the comfort of novelty and reminds us that even our most modern struggles echo ancient concerns. Power, imbalance, excess, forgetting. These are not failures of progress. They are constants of human systems, repeating because the conditions that give rise to them persist. In this light, the Anunnaki no longer belong only to the distant past. They belong to the deep structure of human awareness. They represent the moment when early societies first recognized that survival depended on cooperation with forces larger than individual will. Whether those forces were named gods, nature, or order itself mattered less than the recognition that limits existed. The Sumerians lived close to those limits. Floodplains offered abundance, but only under careful management. Rivers sustained life, but could erase it without warning. Their myths emerged from lived experience, from observation repeated over generations, until it hardened into story. The gods were not invented to escape reality. They were shaped to describe it. This grounding is what gives the myths their lasting weight. They do not float above the world. They arise from it. Even when abstracted, they retain the texture of mud, water, labor, and time. They speak of systems that must be tended, not conquered. As belief recedes, the temptation arises to dismiss myth entirely, to see it as an early mistake, a stage humanity has outgrown. Yet this dismissal overlooks the function myth served. It was not a failed science. It was a shared language for complexity, responsibility, and uncertainty at a time when no other language existed. When that language is lost without replacement, imbalance often follows. Systems are assumed to be stable. Growth is treated as endless. Memory is shortened. The old warnings return, not as gods, but as consequences. Environmental collapse, social fracture, and systemic failure become the modern equivalents of flood and famine. In this sense, ancient myth remains diagnostic. It does not predict specific events, but it identifies pressures. It shows what happens when limits are ignored and when balance is treated as optional. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this insight, not as enforcers, but as embodiments of systemic awareness. To engage with these stories today is not to adopt their worldview wholesale, but to listen for what they preserve. A sensitivity to thresholds, a respect for continuity, a caution against forgetting too quickly. As the journey continues toward its final release, the tone grows quieter still. The myths no longer instruct or warn overtly. They rest. What remains is an atmosphere, a way of holding the world that does not demand certainty, but invites care. In that atmosphere, the ancient voices soften. They no longer speak of gods assembling or waters rising. They speak of attention, of patience, of the slow work of remembering that every system, no matter how powerful, exists within forces it did not create and cannot command. And it is here, in this stillness, that the journey prepares to let go. Not by closing the story, but by allowing it to dissolve gently back into the present, where its patterns continue, unseen yet active, shaping the long and unfinished story of human life. That dissolution back into the present does not feel like an ending. It feels more like a quiet settling, as though the story has always been here, waiting beneath the surface of ordinary time. The ancient world fades, but its contours remain, shaping how we sense continuity, responsibility, and loss, even when we no longer name their origins. In this settling, the Anunnaki become almost indistinguishable from the rhythms of the world itself. They no longer stand apart as figures to be imagined, but as patterns to be noticed. Rise and decline, creation and correction, memory and forgetting. These movements repeat whether they are named or not. Myth once gave them faces so they could be remembered. Now they persist without them. What remains striking is how little the core concerns have changed. Modern societies, for all their complexity, still wrestle with the same tensions the Sumerians observed beside their rivers. How much growth is too much? How power should be limited? How systems respond when balance is ignored? How memory can be preserved across generations that move faster than ever before? In this way, ancient myth does not compete with modern understanding. It complements it. It offers a long view, one shaped not by data points, but by accumulated experience. The Anunnaki were not answers. They were containers, holding together insights that might otherwise scatter and be lost. This is why these stories feel calm rather than urgent. They have already seen collapse. They have already witnessed renewal. They know that endings are rarely final and beginnings are rarely pure. Their patience comes from having no need to persuade. They simply remain. As listeners and inheritors, we are not asked to believe in gods who govern fate. We are asked to recognize patterns that govern systems, to notice when imbalance becomes normalized, to remember that silence, too, is a signal, that what goes unacknowledged does not disappear but accumulates. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their myths were acts of attention. They watched the land, the sky, and each other closely enough to sense when order wavered. They translated those sensations into stories so they could be shared, repeated, and remembered. Today, the translation takes different forms. Models replace omens, data replaces divination, yet the underlying need remains the same: to perceive limits before they are breached, to correct course before correction becomes unavoidable. In this light, the Anunnaki are not relics of a discarded worldview. They are early expressions of a question that never stops being asked. How does order endure in a world defined by change? As the journey continues toward its final quiet movement, that question is allowed to rest without resolution. It does not require an answer. It requires presence, awareness, the willingness to remain attentive even when the gods no longer speak and the stories have grown faint. What follows is not conclusion, but release. A gentle loosening of narrative where the ancient world recedes fully, leaving behind not belief, but a softened gaze, one that looks at the present with a deeper sense of time and listens for patterns that have always been there, waiting to be noticed. That softened gaze is the final gift these myths offer. It is not certainty nor instruction, but a way of seeing that stretches time outward and inward at once. When the ancient world fully recedes, it does not leave emptiness behind. It leaves depth. The present moment becomes layered, carrying traces of countless moments before it, each one shaped by similar hopes, fears, and attempts at balance. In this depth, the Anunnaki no longer feel distant. They feel diffuse, spread across the structures that still govern life, in the assumptions that systems will hold, in the unease that arises when they begin to strain, in the quiet understanding that nothing built without care endures indefinitely. These intuitions are not taught directly. They are inherited. The Sumerians did not imagine themselves as the beginning of history. They believed they stood within a long chain of emergence and collapse. Their myths reflect that humility. Even their gods were shaped by forces older than themselves. Creation did not start cleanly. It unfolded from tension, division, and necessity. This vision leaves little room for final answers, but much room for patience. As later cultures moved away from mythic language, this patience was often lost. The desire for resolution replaced the acceptance of cycle. Progress became the dominant story, and with it came the expectation of permanence. The old myths quietly warned against this expectation, but their voices grew faint. Yet faint does not mean silent. The patterns continue to surface whenever certainty outpaces care, whenever growth ignores limit, whenever memory is shortened for the sake of speed. In these moments, the ancient stories seem to reappear, not as belief, but as recognition, a sense that this has happened before. This recognition does not require reverence for ancient gods. It requires attentiveness to continuity, to the idea that the world responds to how it is treated, whether that response is named divine or systemic. The Anunnaki once carried this idea in human form. Now it moves without form, woven into consequence itself. As this act of the journey comes to rest, the story pauses between worlds. Behind lies the landscape of ancient rivers, temples, and gods assembled in councils beyond memory. Ahead lies a quieter terrain, where myth dissolves into theory, and theory into reflection. The transition is gentle. Nothing is lost abruptly. The old stories simply loosen their grip, allowing the listener to carry what resonates and release what no longer needs form. This is how myths endure, not by insisting, but by remaining available. In the silence that follows, the question persists, unspoken, yet present. Not what the Anunnaki were, but what they represented. Not what the past believed, but what it observed carefully enough to preserve. The journey will continue, not forward in time, but inward, toward interpretation, toward speculation, toward the modern attempts to reassemble meaning from fragments of ancient thought, and finally, toward release, where the story no longer needs to be held at all. For now, there is only stillness, a long pause in which the ancient world has finished speaking, and the present listens quietly, carrying forward what it is ready to remember. From that stillness, a deeper current begins to move. The myths turn once more, not outward toward cities or gods, but inward toward catastrophe itself. This is the point where memory narrows, where stories grow heavier, and where the idea of reset takes on its most serious weight. The ancient imagination does not linger here comfortably. It moves slowly, carefully, as if aware that too much attention might summon what it describes. In Sumerian thought, catastrophe was never random. It was purposeful, though not personal. When destruction came, it arrived as consequence rather than vengeance. The flood was the clearest expression of this logic, but it was not the only one. Famine, invasion, and disease were also understood as mechanisms of correction, ways in which imbalance was forced back into alignment. What makes these stories unsettling is their calm acceptance of loss. Cities could vanish, lineages could end, even favored kings could fall. None of this contradicted the order of the world. It confirmed it. Permanence was never promised. Continuity was. The Anunnaki presided over these resets not as executioners, but as witnesses. They observed the unfolding of necessity. Their authority lay in recognition, not impulse. When correction came, it did so because conditions had been met, not because emotions had flared. This perspective removes comfort, but it also removes cruelty. Destruction is not framed as punishment aimed at individuals. It is framed as recalibration aimed at system. Humanity suffers not because it is hated, but because it is entangled within forces larger than itself. In these moments, myth becomes almost geological. Time stretches. Individual lives blur. What matters is not who survives, but what patterns endure. Memory is carried forward not through bodies alone, but through story. Those who remember become bridges between worlds. The flood narratives emphasize this role. The survivor is not heroic in the modern sense. He is attentive. He listens. He preserves. His task is not to overcome catastrophe, but to carry continuity through it. In this way, survival itself becomes sacred labor. After catastrophe, the world is quieter, emptier. The gods are said to feel this silence as well. Offerings cease. Voices fall away. The absence of humanity reveals its importance within the cosmic system. Humans were not created for dominance, but for participation. Their disappearance disrupts the balance as surely as their excess once did. This realization introduces restraint into the divine order. Limits are placed not only on humanity, but on the scope of correction itself. Total reset gives way to measured response. The cycle continues, but with memory now embedded within it. These stories suggest that learning is possible, even across collapse. Not progress, but adjustment. The world does not move toward perfection. It moves toward survivability. As the narrative deepens into this act of catastrophe and renewal, it becomes clear that the myths are not concerned with endings. They are concerned with thresholds, with the moments where continuation is threatened and where memory must decide what is carried forward. From here, the journey will move fully into the realm of reset, into floods, cosmic upheaval, and the long shadow they cast across human imagination. Not as spectacle, but as quiet reckoning. A reminder that every world, no matter how stable it appears, exists one imbalance away from transformation. That shadow of transformation stretches far beyond any single story. It lingers as a constant awareness that stability is provisional, held in place by attention rather than guaranteed by time. In the aftermath of catastrophe, the myths do not rush to rebuild meaning. They allow space. Silence follows destruction, and within that silence, the world slowly reasserts itself. The earth dries. Rivers find new courses. Ruins settle into the land. What was once center becomes periphery. This slow recovery is essential to the mythic understanding of reset. Renewal is never immediate. It unfolds gradually, requiring patience rather than triumph. Survival is not victory. It is responsibility. Those who endure are tasked not with celebrating escape, but with restoring alignment. Ritual resumes cautiously. Laws are remembered before they are rewritten. Names are spoken again, not to revive the past exactly as it was, but to anchor the present within continuity. The Anunnaki are invoked not as destroyers, but as guarantors that the world can still hold. In these post-catastrophic moments, humanity appears smaller, quieter, more careful. Ambition retreats, attention sharpens. The myths suggest that humility is not learned through instruction, but through loss. Only after silence does listening return. This pattern reflects a deep trust in cycle. Destruction clears excess, but it also clarifies. It strips away assumptions and reveals what is essential. What survives is not strength or dominance, but adaptability and memory. The myths do not praise endurance as stubbornness. They praise it as responsiveness. As generations pass, the memory of catastrophe begins to fade. New structures rise, confidence returns. The same patterns reemerge slowly, almost imperceptibly. The myths acknowledge this inevitability without bitterness. Forgetting is not failure. It is human. This acceptance is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the ancient world view. There is no final safeguard against repetition, no permanent solution. Balance must be maintained continuously, and maintenance is never complete. The Anunnaki do not offer escape from this condition. They embody it. In this sense, catastrophe is not an interruption of order. It is part of order. It is the mechanism through which systems reset when they drift too far from alignment. The world is not broken when it collapses. It is responding. As these ideas settle, the narrative begins to shift once more, from the lived experience of catastrophe to its long echo in imagination. Floods recede, but their memory reshapes law, ritual, and expectation. Entire cultures organize themselves around the desire to prevent another reset, even as they unknowingly repeat the same steps. The Anunnaki stand quietly at the edge of this process. They do not intervene constantly. They observe, they remember, they wait for balance to be lost and found again. And in that waiting, the ancient stories reveal something enduring, that the world is not sustained by certainty, but by attention, that survival is not granted once, but negotiated continuously, and that every moment of stability carries within it the memory of what came before, and the possibility of what may come again. From here, the journey moves deeper into the echo of catastrophe, into the way floods, collapses, and renewals became embedded not only in myth, but in human consciousness itself, a memory passed down not through detail, but through atmosphere, a feeling that the world has ended before, and yet, somehow, continues. That feeling of continuation after ending settles deep within human awareness, often without clear origin. It is the sense that disaster is never entirely new, that something in us recognizes collapse when it approaches. Ancient myth did not merely record catastrophe, it trained perception. It taught societies how to feel the approach of imbalance long before it took visible form. In the Sumerian imagination, floods were remembered not only as events, but as thresholds. They marked the crossing from one order into another. What existed before could not be fully recovered. What followed carried traces of what had been lost. This lingering presence of the past within the present gave myth its emotional weight. Nothing began cleanly. Everything emerged from something else. The Anunnaki presided over this continuity of memory. They were imagined as beings who did not forget between cycles. Where human generations rose and fell, the gods remained, carrying the imprint of multiple worlds. Their role was not to prevent collapse, but to ensure that collapse did not erase meaning entirely. This idea shaped how people understood survival. To endure was not simply to remain alive, it was to remember correctly. Survivors became custodians of alignment, responsible for restoring rhythm rather than reclaiming dominance. The first acts after catastrophe were not conquest or expansion, but ritual and measurement. Calendars were re-established. Boundaries were marked. The world was made legible again. Such stories reveal a worldview deeply attuned to limits. They acknowledge that growth untethered from care leads inevitably to correction. The flood was not feared solely for its destruction, but respected for its function. It reminded humanity that no structure, no matter how elaborate, stands apart from the forces that sustain it. As myths traveled across cultures, this sense of inherited catastrophe remained even when details shifted. Floods appeared in many traditions, not because they all shared a single historical event, but because they shared a common experience of fragility. Water, unpredictable and essential, became the universal symbol of reset. In this way, myth served as a bridge between lived experience and cosmic explanation. It allowed societies to speak about loss without despair, to frame destruction as part of a larger continuity rather than a meaningless end. The Anunnaki anchored this perspective, holding space for both judgment and renewal. Over time, the immediacy of these stories softened. Catastrophe became more distant, more abstract, yet the emotional residue remained, a quiet awareness that systems can fail, that abundance can reverse, that silence can follow noise. This awareness does not produce fear when held gently. It produces caution. It encourages attentiveness. It invites societies to watch their own patterns and recognize when balance begins to slip. As the journey continues, the narrative begins to move beyond catastrophe itself and into its after-effects, into how memory of collapse reshapes culture, law, and expectation long after waters recede, into how humanity learns not to avoid repetition, but to live with its inevitability. The ancient stories do not promise escape from cycle. They offer companionship within it. They remind us that collapse has been faced before, that meaning has survived worse silence, and that continuity depends not on certainty, but on the willingness to remember, rebuild, and remain attentive as the world turns once more. That willingness to remember becomes the quiet foundation upon which cultures rebuild themselves. After catastrophe, memory does not return all at once. It arrives in fragments. A ritual remembered imperfectly, a law repeated with slight variation, a story told with pauses where certainty once lived. These gaps are not mistakes, they are evidence of survival. In Sumerian myth, rebuilding is never portrayed as a restoration of former greatness. It is portrayed as adjustment. The world that emerges after reset is not identical to the one that fell. It is smaller in ambition, narrower in scope, more aware of limits. The gods remain, but their presence feels altered, less immediate, more conditional. The Anunnaki are still invoked, yet now with restraint. Their power is acknowledged alongside an awareness of consequence. The myths suggest that something has been learned, not permanently, but sufficiently to shape the next cycle. Memory becomes precaution rather than nostalgia. This shift is subtle but profound. Where earlier stories focused on establishment of order, post-catastrophic narratives emphasize maintenance. The work of keeping balance replaces the drama of creation. Attention replaces assertion. The sacred moves from spectacle into routine. This is where myth begins to resemble habit. Rituals lose their grandeur but gain persistence. Daily acts carry more weight than heroic deeds. The ordinary becomes sacred because it sustains continuity. The Anunnaki, once central figures of cosmic drama, now recede into the background as guardians of process rather than event. Over generations, this attentiveness slowly erodes. Prosperity returns. Confidence grows. The memory of catastrophe fades into story, then into symbol, then into assumption. The same conditions that once led to imbalance quietly reassemble themselves. Myth does not condemn this. It anticipates it. In this anticipation lies a deep understanding of human nature. Forgetting is not failure. It is renewal's shadow. To live fully requires some release of fear. To build anything lasting requires the willingness to believe it will endure, even when history suggests otherwise. The Anunnaki exist at this intersection. They embody the tension between knowing and forgetting. They remember what humanity cannot sustain continuously. They wait for imbalance to return, not with impatience, but with inevitability. As this cycle repeats, myth becomes less about warning and more about context. It does not shout when collapse approaches. It whispers afterward, reminding survivors that what has happened belongs to a long pattern, not an isolated moment. This whisper is what allows cultures to recover without despair. Collapse is framed not as total failure, but as transition. Loss is acknowledged without becoming absolute. Meaning persists, carried forward by those willing to listen. From here, the journey begins to slow. The rhythm lengthens. The stories grow quieter. The focus shifts from the mechanics of collapse to the internal landscape it leaves behind, toward reflection, humility, and the long patience required to live within cycles without demanding escape. The Anunnaki remain present, but faintly now. Not as figures demanding attention, but as echoes of an understanding that once shaped entire civilizations. An understanding that balance is temporary, memory is fragile, and continuity depends on the quiet, uncelebrated work of remembering just enough to begin again. That quiet work of beginning again rarely announces itself. It unfolds in small gestures, repeated without ceremony, until they gather enough weight to resemble stability. Fields are planted, walls are repaired, calendars are marked once more. None of these acts feel mythic in the moment, yet myth depends on them entirely. Without repetition, story dissolves. Without routine, memory fades. In the ancient imagination, this phase was the most fragile. Not the flood, not the collapse, but the calm that followed. When danger receded and attention loosened, imbalance could quietly return. The Anunnaki were thought to watch most closely during these moments, when humans believed the worst had passed and vigilance softened. This watchfulness was not surveillance. It was expectation. The gods had established patterns. Humanity was now responsible for recognizing them. When correction came again, it would not be because the gods had changed, but because humans had. The myths never framed this as betrayal. They framed it as rhythm. Cycles were not punishments. They were expressions of how the world breathed, expansion and contraction, memory and forgetting, care and neglect. These movements were as natural as the turning of seasons. What made the Anunnaki distinct within this system was their permanence. They did not tire of repetition. They did not demand novelty. They carried forward the same expectations across generations, unaffected by the urgency that drove human ambition. In doing so, they represented continuity itself. This continuity offered a strange comfort. Even when cities fell, something endured. Not buildings or dynasties, but pattern. The world might reset, but it did not unravel. There was always ground beneath the water, always silence after noise, always the possibility of listening again. As time passed, these ideas became embedded less in explicit myth and more in inherited behavior. Societies developed customs that mirrored ancient warnings without naming them. Restrictions on power, ritualized pauses, seasonal observances. Each acted as a small correction, a way of maintaining balance without invoking catastrophe. Yet no system holds indefinitely. Growth returns, complexity increases, attention fragments. The same pressures that once led to collapse begin to gather again, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The myths do not express frustration at this repetition. They accept it. In this acceptance lies a deep realism. The world is not designed for permanence. It is designed for continuity through change. The Anunnaki embody this principle. They do not prevent collapse. They ensure that collapse does not end meaning. As the journey continues toward its final act, this realism becomes central. The ancient stories are no longer recounting events. They are offering a posture toward existence, one that neither clings to stability nor welcomes destruction, but recognizes both as necessary movements within a larger whole. The Anunnaki fade further now, almost completely into abstraction. What remains is their function: to hold memory across time, to witness repetition without despair, to remind humanity, quietly and without urgency, that every beginning carries an ending, and every ending carries the seed of another beginning, waiting patiently beneath the surface of the world. That patience beneath the surface is the final constant the myths preserve. It is not hope in the modern sense, tied to progress or resolution. It is endurance without expectation. The ancient imagination understood that cycles do not exist to be escaped. They exist to be lived within, carefully, attentively, and without illusion. By this stage of the mythic arc, the Anunnaki have almost completely withdrawn from the foreground. They no longer act. They no longer speak. They simply remain. Their presence is felt as background pressure, like gravity, shaping outcomes without announcing itself. This withdrawal is not loss. It is completion. The lesson has been delivered as fully as it can be. What remains is humanity, moving within structures inherited rather than chosen. Laws still carry echoes of divine decree. Authority still seeks legitimacy beyond itself. Even when gods are no longer named, power continues to search for justification in something older, larger, and more enduring than individual will. The myths suggest that this search is not misguided. It is instinctive. Human systems sense their own fragility. They reach backward into memory, borrowing weight from the past to stabilize the present. The Anunnaki once served this function explicitly. Now it is carried by tradition, history, and the quiet unease that arises when continuity feels threatened. This unease is not fear. It is awareness, a recognition that balance is provisional, that order requires tending, and that forgetting is always closer than we believe. The ancient stories did not try to eliminate this awareness. They cultivated it. In doing so, they offered a form of wisdom that does not age. Not instruction, but orientation. A way of standing within time that neither denies collapse nor rushes toward it. A posture that accepts uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. As this understanding settles, the narrative begins to loosen its hold. The rhythm slows further. The need for explanation fades. What matters now is not what happened in the distant past, but how those ancient perceptions still shape the present moment. The Anunnaki, in their final form, are no longer gods of storm or flood or judgment. They are the memory that systems have limits, the reminder that excess accumulates quietly, the sense that silence often follows noise, and that rebuilding requires patience more than power. This is why the myths were told softly, repeated calmly, and preserved carefully. They were not meant to shock or persuade. They were meant to endure alongside human life, offering companionship rather than command. As the journey moves closer to its end, the story releases its final grip on form. The ancient world dissolves almost completely now, leaving behind only an atmosphere, a slow, steady awareness that the world has been made and unmade before, and that meaning has survived both. In that awareness, the listener is no longer separate from the myth. The cycle does not belong to gods or ancestors alone. It continues wherever attention fades and returns, wherever balance is lost and restored, wherever memory is carried forward quietly, without demand, as the world turns once more. Within that turning, the ancient story no longer feels distant. It feels intimate, almost personal, as though it has been unfolding quietly alongside every human life. Birth, growth, strain, release. These movements mirror the larger cycles the myths describe. The Anunnaki were never meant to stand apart from this rhythm. They were meant to give it shape, so it could be recognized. By now, the language of gods has thinned to transparency. What remains is structure without figure, pattern without name. The myths have done their work. They have carried attention across catastrophe and calm, across forgetting and remembrance, until meaning no longer requires a voice. This is the moment where ancient narrative and present awareness meet, not through belief, but through recognition. The world is felt as something that responds, not morally, not emotionally, but structurally. When pressure builds, release follows. When care weakens, correction emerges. These responses do not need intention. They are woven into how systems behave. The Sumerians sensed this long before it could be measured or modeled. They watched rivers change course, cities rise and fall, soil grow rich and then barren. They encoded these observations into stories that could travel across generations. The Anunnaki were the vessels that carried this knowledge forward when nothing else could. Now those vessels are empty, or perhaps full in a different way. The figures have dissolved, but the awareness remains. The myths have become internalized, functioning as intuition rather than instruction. In this internal space, responsibility feels heavier and lighter at once. Heavier because there is no longer a divine assembly to appeal to. Lighter because the patterns are visible. One does not need permission to notice imbalance. One needs only attention. This attention is the final inheritance of the ancient world. Not ritual, not law, not fear of gods, but sensitivity to threshold, the ability to sense when something has grown too rigid, too expansive, too detached from the forces that sustain it. As the narrative approaches its final movement, even this sensitivity begins to soften. The story no longer asks the listener to carry its lessons consciously. It releases them gently, trusting that what matters has already settled. The Anunnaki, once imagined as judges of fate, now resemble something closer to time itself. Impartial, enduring, patient, beyond measure. They do not hurry, collapse. They do not prevent renewal. They simply witness. And in that witnessing there is peace. Not because outcomes are controlled, but because they are understood. The world does not demand certainty to continue. It asks only that attention return from time to time, long enough to remember that nothing stands alone, and nothing ends without leaving something behind. From here, the story quiets further. Words loosen, images fade. What remains is a sense of belonging to a much longer movement, one that began before names and will continue after them, carrying forward the quiet rhythm of creation and release, again and again, without urgency, without conclusion. That quiet rhythm carries us to the edge of resolution without ever fully arriving there. The ancient myths slow almost to stillness at this point, as if aware that too much explanation would disturb what has finally settled. The Anunnaki no longer appear even as abstractions. They have dissolved completely into the movement of time itself, indistinguishable from the rise and fall they once governed. What remains is a sense of continuity that no longer depends on story. The listener does not need to remember names, places, or events. The essence has already passed inward. It lives now as atmosphere, as a softened awareness that the world is older than any single moment and larger than any single life. In this space, catastrophe loses its drama. Renewal loses its triumph. Both are understood as phases rather than conclusions. The flood is no longer water. It is pressure released. The city is no longer brick. It is structure formed. When either dissolves, nothing essential is lost. The pattern continues. The ancient storytellers seem to understand this deeply. Their myths do not close with victory or defeat. They fade. They allow the listener to drift back into ordinary life, carrying a subtle shift in perception. The world feels slightly wider, slightly slower, slightly more patient than before. This patience is the final lesson, though lesson is too strong a word. It is an orientation. a way of standing within uncertainty without demanding resolution, a way of accepting that meaning does not arrive fully formed, but accumulates slowly through repetition, attention, and care. The Anunnaki once embodied this orientation in divine form. Now it belongs to no one. It is available wherever balance is noticed and respected, wherever silence is allowed to follow noise, wherever rebuilding is approached without illusion of permanence. As this act of the journey concludes, the narrative releases its last attachment to explanation. The ancient world has spoken as much as it can. What remains cannot be narrated. It can only be carried. The story does not end here. It simply becomes quieter than language. It moves into the pauses between thoughts, into the spaces where reflection settles naturally. There is no need to hold on to it. What mattered has already taken root. And so the ancient cycle continues, not as myth remembered, but as rhythm lived, creation and release, memory and forgetting, attention returning again and again, gently, endlessly, without demand. From here, the journey turns fully toward interpretation, toward the modern attempt to name what ancient myth once held without needing to define. And finally, toward rest, where the story is allowed to dissolve completely, leaving only the calm awareness that it has always been here, waiting patiently beneath the surface of time. From this point of rest, interpretation begins, not as intrusion, but as a natural response of the modern mind, which seeks to name what it has felt. When ancient myth dissolves into atmosphere, curiosity returns quietly, asking what these stories mean now, in a world shaped by different tools, different fears, and different scales of awareness. Modern interpretations of the Anunnaki often arise from this threshold, from the moment where myth no longer commands belief, but still exerts gravity. In the absence of shared ritual and sacred context, imagination reaches for new frameworks to contain the old weight. Science, astronomy, psychology, and speculation become vessels for ancient intuitions. In these reinterpretations, gods become metaphors made concrete once more. Cosmic order becomes cosmic engineering. Divine descent becomes arrival from elsewhere. What was once symbolic of responsibility and balance is recast as evidence of intervention, design, or forgotten superiority. The ancient need to situate humanity within something larger resurfaces, wearing unfamiliar language. This is not a mistake unique to the present. It is a repetition of an older movement. Just as earlier cultures reshaped Sumerian myth to fit imperial order or theological clarity, modern culture reshapes it to fit technological consciousness. Each era hears the ancient stories through its own questions. What changes is not the myth's core, but its surface. The Anunnaki remain figures of origin, authority, and inheritance. Only the explanation shifts. Where priests once spoke of cosmic decree, modern interpreters speak of advanced knowledge. Where hymns once described divine craftsmanship, speculation imagines tools and techniques. Yet beneath these retellings, the same tension persists. Humanity senses that it did not arise alone, that its systems are fragile, and that knowledge carries responsibility. Whether framed as gods or visitors, the underlying concern is identical. How does power begin, and how should it be held? The danger arises when interpretation replaces listening entirely, when myth is treated only as puzzle to be solved rather than as mirror to be faced. In these moments, the story is flattened, its patience is lost, its silence is filled too quickly with certainty. Ancient myth did not offer explanations that closed inquiry. It offered forms that could hold uncertainty without resolving it. When modern interpretation insists on answers, it often loses what the myth preserved most carefully: ambiguity, threshold, pause. This does not mean reinterpretation is wrong. It is inevitable. Every generation must translate inheritance into its own language. But translation requires humility, an awareness that what is carried forward is not truth as fact, but meaning as relationship. As this journey moves through interpretation and theory, it does so gently without insistence. Not to confirm or deny modern claims, but to observe why they arise. To notice how ancient stories continue to function as containers for questions that never disappear. The Anunnaki, in this final arc, are no longer gods of Sumer alone. They are reflections of the human need to place itself within a larger order, to explain its origins, and to justify its structures. Whether named divine, alien, or symbolic, they reveal more about the interpreter than the past itself. From here, the narrative will continue toward reflection rather than conclusion, toward the understanding that every reinterpretation is itself a myth in formation, shaped by the same forces of memory, fear, and longing that shaped the first stories beside ancient rivers, under a sky that felt endlessly alive. Seen this way, modern theories become part of the same long continuum rather than a break from it. They are not intrusions into ancient myth, but echoes of it, shaped by contemporary language and expectation. When people search for hidden knowledge in the past, they are often responding to a quiet unease in the present, a sense that something essential has been lost, or that meaning has become unmoored from origin. The Anunnaki provide a surface onto which this unease can be projected. They occupy the deep past, where certainty is impossible and imagination has room to move. This distance makes them ideal carriers of speculation. They can be shaped into engineers, teachers, conquerors, or caretakers, depending on what the present most needs to explain or justify. In this way, modern reinterpretations function much like ancient myth itself. They organize anxiety. They offer coherence where complexity feels overwhelming. They allow people to believe that humanity's achievements and failures are part of a larger design, rather than the product of fragile systems and imperfect choices. What often goes unnoticed is that this impulse mirrors the very mindset of the Sumerians. They too lived in a world where forces exceeded individual control. They too sought patterns that could stabilize understanding. The difference lies not in the desire for explanation, but in the way uncertainty is held. Ancient myth allowed uncertainty to remain open. It did not require closure. It accepted contradiction, disagreement among gods, and cycles without resolution. Modern interpretation, shaped by scientific and technological habits of thought, often seeks definitive answers. It prefers origins that can be pointed to, causes that can be isolated, and narratives that move forward rather than circle. This preference can obscure the deeper function of myth. When stories are treated as puzzles, their capacity to shape perception is reduced. They become objects of debate rather than environments of meaning. The Anunnaki become either real or false, rather than resonant. Yet resonance is what has kept these stories alive. Long after belief fades, resonance remains. It lives in the way people respond to scale, to antiquity, to the sense that humanity is not the center of existence. It emerges whenever we look at the night sky and feel both curiosity and unease. The ancient storytellers did not resolve this feeling. They gave it form. They placed gods in the heavens not to explain the stars, but to acknowledge their presence, to say, quietly, that the universe was not empty, and that human life unfolded within something vast and indifferent yet structured. Modern reinterpretations often reverse this relationship. They use the universe to explain the gods. They search outward for validation rather than inward for alignment. This reversal reflects a shift in trust, away from inherited wisdom and toward external confirmation. Neither approach is complete on its own. Ancient myth without reinterpretation risks stagnation. Modern theory without myth risks fragmentation. The enduring power of the Anunnaki lies in their ability to bridge these tendencies, offering a form that can hold both wonder and restraint. As this reflective arc continues, the focus turns toward synthesis rather than judgment, toward the possibility that ancient myth and modern interpretation are not rivals, but partners in an ongoing attempt to understand what it means to exist within systems larger than ourselves. The story does not ask us to choose between gods and theories. It invites us to notice the pattern that gives rise to both, the pattern of looking outward when the present feels unstable, and of returning to the past when the future feels uncertain. In this movement, the Anunnaki continue to function as they always have, not as answers, but as quiet companions in humanity's search for orientation within time. This search for orientation has never truly paused. It only changes its language. When ancient myth recedes, theory steps forward. When theory grows rigid, story returns. Each movement responds to the same underlying need, to locate oneself within a vast, shifting world and to feel that existence, however fragile, participates in something coherent. The Anunnaki endure precisely because they sit at this intersection. They are ancient enough to feel foundational, yet abstract enough to be reshaped repeatedly. They occupy a space where certainty dissolves and interpretation begins. This makes them less like historical figures and more like lenses, shaping how different eras look back at origins. In modern thought, this lens often focuses on questions of intelligence, design, and inheritance. Not only biological inheritance, but cultural and technological inheritance. The question is no longer simply who came before us, but what they left behind, intentionally or not. The Anunnaki become symbols of that inheritance, imagined as carriers of knowledge rather than enforcers of order. This shift reflects a broader transformation in how authority is understood. Ancient societies placed authority above. Modern societies locate it in systems, processes, and data. Yet both struggle with the same dilemma: how to ensure that what is inherited is used responsibly, how to prevent knowledge from becoming imbalance. In Sumerian myth, this responsibility was externalized. The gods held the weight, humans followed. In modern interpretation, the weight returns to humanity. There are no divine assemblies to convene. Decisions are made without appeal to cosmic decree. The burden of balance rests on systems humans design themselves. This return of responsibility often feels overwhelming. It can produce longing for guidance, for a sense that someone or something else is watching, measuring, correcting. In this longing, ancient gods are reimagined not as symbols, but as supervisors. The myth regains form because the anxiety that shaped it has returned. Yet the ancient stories do not promise relief from responsibility. They distribute it. They show that even gods operate within limits, that authority is inherited, not absolute, and that correction applies upward as well as downward. The Anunnaki themselves were bound by older forces, older orders, older necessities. This is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the myth. The gods were not ultimate. They were part of a chain. This idea quietly undermines any interpretation that seeks perfect control, whether divine or technological. It suggests that no system escapes consequence. No intelligence exists without constraint. As this realization settles, modern interpretation begins to soften. The need to literalize fades. The story regains depth. The Anunnaki are no longer required to be real in a physical sense to be meaningful. They function again as reminders of limit, continuity, and inherited responsibility. This return to resonance does not reject science or theory. It contextualizes them. It places modern knowledge within a longer human effort to observe patterns and respond to them with care. The tools have changed. The attention remains. As the narrative continues its final descent into reflection, the emphasis moves away from explanation entirely. What matters now is not what the Anunnaki were or were not, but what their persistence reveals. That humanity has always sensed its own fragility. That it has always searched for structures to hold meaning steady. And that when those structures falter, the oldest stories rise again, not to answer questions, but to remind us that we have faced uncertainty before. The journey approaches its final quiet arc now. The voice lowers. Interpretation gives way to acceptance. The myth does not need to be resolved. It only needs to be released, gently, back into the long flow of human memory where it has always belonged. That release does not feel like forgetting. It feels like trust. A trust that what has been carried this far does not need to be held tightly anymore. The ancient stories have already done their work. They have shaped perception, softened certainty, and widened the sense of time enough to allow the present to breathe. At this stage, the Anunnaki exist only as absence, not erased, but no longer required. Their outlines dissolve into the background of thought, leaving behind a quiet sensitivity to scale, to consequence, to the long rhythm beneath immediate experience. The myth completes itself by disappearing. This disappearance mirrors the way meaning often operates in human life. What matters most rarely remains vivid or explicit. It settles into habit, intuition, and unspoken awareness. The stories we no longer repeat are often the ones that have shaped us most deeply. Ancient myth understood this. It did not seek permanence through fixation, but through diffusion. By allowing stories to change, soften, and eventually fade, it ensured that what mattered would survive in forms flexible enough to endure. The Anunnaki were never meant to remain intact. They were meant to dissolve into understanding. In this dissolution, the distinction between ancient and modern loses importance. The same pressures persist, the same cycles turn. The same need for balance reasserts itself whenever systems grow too rigid or too ambitious. The language shifts, but the experience remains. What replaces myth is not emptiness, but a quieter form of knowing, one that does not require belief, but awareness, one that does not promise protection, but perspective. This knowing does not announce itself. It waits to be noticed. The ancient storytellers trusted this process. They did not insist on fidelity. They allowed their stories to drift, confident that what was essential would resurface when needed. The Anunnaki were one such resurfacing, shaped by a particular time and place, carrying a universal concern. Now, that concern returns to anonymity. It belongs to no name, no god, no theory. It exists wherever attention returns to limits, wherever memory slows ambition, wherever continuity is valued over conquest. As this penultimate movement settles, the narrative prepares to rest completely. There is nothing left to explain. The journey has not led to a conclusion, but to a release from the need for one. The ancient world does not ask to be remembered exactly as it was. It asks only to be allowed to pass through, leaving behind what it always intended to leave, a way of sensing the world as older than certainty, larger than intention, and patient enough to continue without our understanding. In this space, the story becomes indistinguishable from silence, and in that silence, something remains, not the Anunnaki themselves, but the calm awareness that stories end not by closing, but by becoming unnecessary. In that quiet where stories become unnecessary, reflection deepens without effort. There is no longer a need to hold the ancient world at a distance, to analyze or interpret it. The myths have settled into something closer to atmosphere than narrative, like a change in light that alters how familiar things are seen without drawing attention to itself. Here, the Anunnaki are no longer figures of thought, but traces of a posture toward existence. A posture that accepts uncertainty without rushing to explain it, that recognizes limits without demanding escape, that understands continuity not as permanence, but as the ability to begin again without forgetting entirely. This posture is subtle. It does not announce itself as wisdom. It feels more like calm, a sense that the world does not require constant mastery to remain meaningful, that systems, whether natural or human-made, speak through their behavior if attention is given long enough. The ancient myths trained this attention gently. They did not ask listeners to solve the universe. They asked them to notice when balance shifted, to feel when something grew too loud, too fast, too certain. The gods existed to make these sensations legible, to give them form so they could be remembered. In modern life, these sensations often return without form. Unease appears without clear cause. Confidence wavers even amid progress. There is a growing sense that acceleration does not always mean advancement. These feelings are not new. They are echoes of the same awareness that once shaped myth. The difference now is that there is no shared story to contain them. Each person encounters them privately, translating them into anxiety, philosophy, activism, or silence. Yet beneath these varied expressions lies the same ancient recognition. That balance matters, that forgetting has consequences, that continuity is fragile. The Anunnaki once held these recognitions collectively. They allowed entire societies to share a language for limits. Their absence leaves a gap that cannot be filled by data alone. Something quieter is required, something closer to attentiveness than explanation. This attentiveness does not demand belief in ancient gods. It does not ask for return or revival. It asks only for patience, for the willingness to pause long enough to notice patterns repeating, to recognize that systems under strain behave predictably, even when their scale changes. As the narrative moves closer to its final stillness, even this reflection begins to soften. The story no longer seeks to be understood. It seeks to be released fully. The ancient world has offered what it could. What remains belongs to the present moment alone. In this release, there is no loss, only space. Space for the listener to carry forward whatever resonated and to leave behind what no longer needs form. This is how ancient myth survives without insisting. It dissolves, trusting that what matters will reappear when conditions require it. The journey continues not as a story remembered, but as a rhythm felt. And in that rhythm, the ancient and the modern are no longer separate. They are simply different moments within the same long movement, unfolding quietly, without urgency, as they always have. That long movement carries everything forward without asking for acknowledgement. It does not require belief, memory, or interpretation to continue. It moves through human life the way seasons move through land, shaping without consulting, teaching without instruction. The ancient myths sense this movement and learn to speak alongside it rather than over it. At this stage, even reflection begins to thin. The mind no longer circles the story, searching for insight. Instead, insight arrives quietly, already formed, requiring no effort to hold. The Anunnaki are no longer referenced even inwardly. Their work is complete. They have delivered the listener to a place where meaning no longer depends on form. This is where myth fulfills its deepest function, not to be remembered, but to change how remembering works, to shift attention from surface events to underlying patterns, to replace urgency with awareness, to soften the fear of endings by embedding them within a larger continuity that does not collapse when individual moments pass. The Sumerians lived close to this understanding because their world demanded it. Uncertainty was constant. Stability was temporary. The land itself taught impermanence. Myth arose not to deny this reality, but to accompany it, to give it a voice that could be shared without panic. In the modern world, the same pressures exist, though often disguised by complexity. Systems appear stable until they are not. Growth feels natural until limits assert themselves. When these moments arrive, the ancient awareness resurfaces, often without name or origin, felt as a sudden recognition rather than a lesson learned. This recognition does not point backward in longing. It does not ask for a return to gods or temples. It points inward and outward at once. Inward toward attention, outward toward pattern. It invites the listener to stand within time rather than above it. As the narrative approaches its final act, words become almost unnecessary. The story has gradually removed itself, layer by layer, until only orientation remains. A sense of how to be present without demanding control, how to notice change without resisting it, how to carry memory without clinging. The ancient storytellers understood when to stop speaking. They allowed silence to do the rest. Silence was not absence. It was space for alignment, a place where the world could be felt directly, without myth standing between experience and awareness. In this silence, the journey does not end, it settles. Like sediment in clear water, everything unnecessary drifts downward, leaving behind a calm transparency. The world remains complex, uncertain, and vast, but it no longer feels unmoored. From here, the final movement unfolds without effort. There is nothing left to resolve. The ancient cycle has been traced, not to its conclusion, but to its release. What continues now is not the story, but the quiet recognition that the story was never separate from life itself, and that its rhythm continues, gently, patiently, beyond words. Within that patience beyond words, the last traces of narrative loosen completely. What once needed description now simply exists. The ancient myths no longer feel like something encountered. They feel like something remembered without memory, present without effort. The journey has carried awareness to a place where explanation would feel like interruption. Here, time stretches softly. Past and present no longer press against one another. They overlap, indistinct, as though all moments share the same depth. The Anunnaki, once imagined as ancient witnesses, dissolve into this depth entirely. Their long watching becomes indistinguishable from time itself, steady and impartial. This is the quiet truth the myths circled without naming, that existence does not require constant narration to remain meaningful, that order and change coexist without needing justification, that the world continues whether or not it is understood. The Sumerians sensed this at the edges of their stories. After floods, after kings fell, after temples were rebuilt, there was always a return to ordinary life. Work resumed, children were born, seasons turned, the gods were honored, but life did not wait for certainty. Meaning unfolded through participation, not comprehension. This participation is the final inheritance left behind, not belief, not doctrine, not explanation. Simply the willingness to remain engaged with the world as it is, attentive to its shifts without demanding permanence. The myths taught this not by instruction, but by repetition, by showing again and again that continuation mattered more than conclusion. In this sense, the Anunnaki were never meant to be understood fully. They were meant to be outgrown, not forgotten, but absorbed. Their authority was always temporary, a scaffolding to support awareness until awareness could stand on its own. As this realization settles, even the need for reflection fades. The story has become transparent. It no longer draws attention to itself. It simply allows the listener to rest within the long rhythm it described. Nothing has been lost in this release. Everything essential has been carried forward. The cycle continues, not as myth remembered, but as presence lived. Attention rises and falls. Balance is lost and restored. Memory softens and sharpens as needed. This is where the ancient narrative ends, not with silence, but with ease. The ease of no longer needing to hold the past apart from the present. The ease of recognizing that every moment belongs to a much longer unfolding, one that does not hurry and does not conclude. From here, the final movement remains, a gentle closing that does not resolve, but rests. A return not to the beginning, but to the ongoing flow where stories dissolve naturally, and the world continues, quietly, carrying everything forward without demand. That ongoing flow is where the ancient and the present finally meet without tension. There is no need to reconcile them. They recognize one another naturally, like reflections on water that align when the surface grows still. What once felt distant in time now feels familiar in rhythm. The myths have completed their long arc, not by arriving at truth, but by releasing the need to define it. In this place, the Anunnaki are no longer remembered as figures, nor even as ideas. They have become an inherited sensibility, a way of noticing when the world is being pushed too hard, a quiet instinct to pause when growth accelerates without care, a subtle awareness that systems speak through strain long before they break. This sensibility does not demand attention. It waits. It surfaces during moments of fatigue, during pauses between decisions, during the brief silence after ambition has exhausted itself. It is not dramatic. It does not announce danger. It simply invites listening. The ancient storytellers trusted this invitation. They understood that meaning cannot be forced into permanence. It must be allowed to fade and return, shaped by need rather than preservation. Their myths were not monuments. They were currents, meant to move through human life and then pass on. In letting the story go, nothing essential disappears. The patterns remain. The world continues to reveal itself through repetition and variation. What changes is the relationship to those patterns. Fear loosens, urgency softens, attention becomes steadier. This steadiness is the final gift of the long mythic cycle. Not certainty, but composure, the ability to remain present within change without demanding control over it. The understanding that collapse and renewal are not failures of meaning, but expressions of it. Here, the narrative no longer needs to guide. It has already done so by stepping aside. What remains belongs entirely to the listener, carried forward as atmosphere rather than instruction. There is no responsibility to remember details, names, or sequences. Only the rhythm matters. As this act concludes, the story does not close its eyes. It rests. Like land after floodwater recedes, it settles quietly, reshaped but intact. Life resumes without ceremony. The past remains present without insisting on recognition. The Anunnaki, once imagined as standing at the threshold of time, now stand nowhere at all, or perhaps everywhere, in the patience of seasons, in the limits that reassert themselves gently, in the long continuity that does not require witnesses to endure. From here, the final movement will carry the story fully into rest, not toward sleep alone, but toward a calm acceptance that stories end when they have been lived enough to no longer need telling. And in that calm, the ancient world releases its last hold, trusting the present to continue the cycle in its own quiet way. In this final descent toward rest, the story loosens its last threads. What remains is not a message, but a presence, a calm awareness that does not seek to persuade or instruct, only to accompany. The ancient world has withdrawn completely now, not into obscurity, but into continuity, where it no longer needs to be named to be felt. The Anunnaki have finished their long work. They no longer stand as guardians of cities or arbiters of fate. They have become indistinguishable from the patience of time itself, from the way generations replace one another without erasing what came before, from the way meaning survives even when belief changes shape. In this space, the idea of inheritance becomes gentle rather than heavy. Nothing is demanded. Nothing is owed. The past does not insist on relevance. It simply offers itself as depth, allowing the present to feel less isolated, less urgent, less alone. This is the quiet gift of ancient myth when it is allowed to complete its cycle. It does not bind, it releases. It reminds without burden. It suggests that whatever uncertainty the present carries has been carried before, and that life continued anyway, reshaped but intact. Here, reflection no longer points backward or forward. It settles into now. The world feels neither finished nor unfinished. It simply feels ongoing. Breath follows breath. Thought rises and falls. Attention drifts and returns. The same rhythms the myths once described in gods and floods are felt again in smaller, more intimate ways. The ancient storytellers understood this intimacy. They knew that the greatest continuity was not held in temples or tablets, but in lived experience, in the way people endured loss, adapted, and began again without needing to fully explain why. As this awareness deepens, even the idea of cycle becomes unnecessary. There is no need to frame experience within structure anymore. The structure has dissolved into trust, trust that the world continues. Trust that meaning does not vanish when stories fade. Trust that attention, once learned, can return on its own. This trust is not passive. It is not resignation. It is composure, a calm acceptance that existence does not require constant reinforcement to remain significant. That life, in its ordinary unfolding, carries enough depth when it is allowed to be felt slowly. And so the story rests here, not closed, not concluded, but complete in the way a day completes itself at dusk. Nothing dramatic, no final declaration, just a soft dimming where what mattered has already been absorbed, and what remains does not need words. The ancient world has stepped back fully now. The Anunnaki have become silence, and in that silence, the listener is left not with emptiness, but with space. Space to breathe, space to rest, space to continue quietly, carrying forward the long, patient rhythm that has always been there, waiting to be noticed. In the space that remains, the mind begins to drift naturally, no longer guided by narrative but supported by it. The ancient voices do not return. They are not needed. What they carried has already settled into a deeper layer of awareness, where it no longer needs words to remain present. This is where the long arc of inheritance becomes almost invisible, not absent, just integrated. The past does not stand behind demanding recognition. It stands beneath, offering steadiness. Like ground that holds without being seen, it allows movement without asking for acknowledgement. Here, the Anunnaki exist only as a memory of memory itself, a reminder that humans once needed figures to hold what now can be felt directly: limits, continuity, the quiet intelligence of systems that endure not through force, but through balance. These ideas no longer require shape. They have become part of how the world is sensed. The ancient storytellers trusted this moment. They knew when to stop speaking. They allowed silence to complete what language began. Silence was not emptiness to them. It was the final vessel, wide enough to hold everything without naming anything. In this silence, time feels less urgent. The future does not press forward demanding resolution. The past does not pull backward asking to be recovered. Both relax into the present, where attention rests lightly, unburdened by the need to decide what anything ultimately means. This resting is not escape. It is alignment, a return to the natural pace at which understanding matures when it is not forced. The myths have done what they were meant to do. They have slowed the listener enough to feel the long rhythm beneath immediate thought. Nothing further is required. There is no lesson to extract, no conclusion to reach. The ancient world has already withdrawn as far as it needs to. What remains belongs entirely to now, shaped quietly by everything that came before. As this final act continues to soften, even the awareness of having listened begins to fade. The story no longer stands apart from experience. It blends into it, like a remembered dream that leaves behind mood rather than image. The Anunnaki, once imagined as standing at the beginning of civilization, now rest at the edge of awareness, indistinguishable from the calm that follows deep reflection. They have not vanished. They have simply become unnecessary. And so the journey moves toward its final stillness, not an ending marked by words, but a release marked by ease, where nothing more needs to be said, because everything that needed to be carried forward already has been. The world continues, as it always has, quietly, patiently, without needing to explain itself. And within that continuation, the ancient story rests at last, complete not because it ended, but because it no longer needs to be told. In this near-complete stillness, awareness becomes almost weightless. The story has receded so far that it no longer feels like something external that was heard or followed. It feels internal now, indistinguishable from the quiet rhythm of thought itself. What began as ancient myth has dissolved into a state of calm recognition, where nothing needs to be held in mind to remain present. Here, the sense of time softens even further. There is no urgency to move forward, no pull to look back. The present widens, accommodating memory and anticipation without tension. The long arc of human experience feels less like a sequence of events and more like a continuous breath, expanding and releasing without effort. The Anunnaki, whose names once carried the weight of heavens and destinies, have completed their final transformation. They are no longer figures, symbols, or even abstractions. They are the quiet assurance that life has passed through many forms and will continue to do so. That nothing essential is lost when names fade. That continuity does not depend on remembrance alone. This assurance is gentle. It does not promise safety or certainty. It offers steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing that collapse and renewal are not opposites but partners. That silence is not absence but space. That endings are not failures but moments where holding gives way to release. In this understanding, there is rest, not the rest of escape, but the rest of belonging. The sense that one does not stand outside the flow of time trying to understand it, but within it, carried naturally by its movement. The ancient myths were never meant to lift humanity above the world. They were meant to place it within. As the last movement approaches, even this understanding loosens. It no longer needs to be articulated or reflected upon. It simply remains as atmosphere, as ease, as the quiet after a long day when nothing more needs to be accomplished. The story has reached the point where it cannot continue without becoming repetition, and so it prepares to stop, not abruptly, but the way light fades at evening, gradually, kindly, without drawing attention to itself. What remains now is not the memory of Anunnaki, nor the lessons of myth, nor the interpretation of history. What remains is calm, a calm shaped by the knowledge that life has always unfolded within cycles, and that awareness, once touched, does not need to be held tightly to endure. In this calm, the ancient world rests completely. The present feels sufficient, and the listener is left not with questions, but with quiet space, ready for sleep, reflection, or simple continuation, as the long rhythm carries everything forward into the final gentle pause. Now, only the pause remains. Not a pause waiting to be filled, but one that is complete on its own, the kind that arrives naturally when nothing else needs to be said. The story has given everything it carried, and what remains cannot be improved by words. In this final stillness, there is no sense of conclusion, only settling. Like dust after a long journey, everything unnecessary has fallen away. What endures is light, spacious, and quiet. The ancient world no longer stands behind the present. It rests within it, indistinguishable from the calm that comes when understanding no longer seeks form. The Anunnaki have reached their last transformation. They are no longer gods, myths, symbols, or ideas. They have become silence shaped by memory, a silence that holds depth rather than emptiness, a silence that knows cycles without needing to name them. Here, the listener is not separate from the story. There is no boundary left between myth and moment. Breath, awareness, and time move together without friction. The long human effort to explain existence relaxes, trusting that existence continues regardless of explanation. This is the place the ancient storytellers always led toward, even if they never named it. a place where attention rests gently on the world as it is, without urgency to define or control, where continuity is felt rather than proven, where the past no longer asks to be remembered, because it has already become part of how the present is held. Nothing is demanded here. There is no lesson to apply, no belief to adopt, no memory to preserve. The story has completed itself by dissolving fully into experience. What mattered has been carried forward naturally, without effort. If sleep arrives now, let it arrive. If wakefulness remains, let it remain quietly. Both belong equally to this moment. The ancient rhythm does not distinguish between them. It moves beneath both, steady and patient. And so the journey ends in the only way it ever could. Not with an answer, not with an ending, but with rest. A rest wide enough to hold everything that came before and everything that will come after. The world continues. The cycle turns. Memory softens. Attention drifts and returns. And beneath it all, the long, calm rhythm remains, unchanged, carrying everything forward without sound, without demand, and without end.